Welcome again, everyone, and thank you for your patience. We don't always give you a view behind the scenes like this. And little did I know when I wrote this introduction, it starts out, for the second time this week, welcome to an engaging experience with art. And our Tuesday lecture, we also had problems at the start. So little did I know I was predicting things. Tuesday, we were invited into the creative process of a charming contemporary artist. Tonight, we are privileged to have a special event and hear about a masterpiece of art from an earlier time. This event is special also because it's another chance to hear the eloquent storytelling of Rebecca Albiani. Rebecca is a good friend and an art mentor for Horizon House. She needs no further introduction, except for me to say that this talk is co-sponsored by the Seattle Perugia Sister City Association, and we warmly welcome their members. Rebecca will have more to say about Seattle's Sister City connection. So now let's time travel. I mean that in the better sense, with Rebecca to Perugia for another engaging art experience.
Thank you so much. Seattle's Italian sister city is Perugia, which is located in Umbria, just south of Tuscany, about midway between Florence and Rome. So the Seattle Perugia Sister City Association has a variety of activities, of which this is one. And thank you so much to the Horizon House Art Committee for hosting us. A variety of activities to encourage connection between our two cities. I had the great privilege to have a scholarship. It is our signature program as a sister city organization to send often 4 Seattleites every year to study for a month at the famous University for Foreigners in Perugia to study Italian. And so I had the tremendous privilege to be studying Italian in Perugia last October. And when I was there, I got to see this absolutely spectacular room painted by the artist who is known as the Perugian, Il Perugino, Pietro Perugino, who wasn't actually born in Perugino proper, but nearby. So it would be like being from Linwood and calling yourself the Seattleite. But Perugino, who has a huge statue to him in Perugia, and the main thoroughfare is called Corso Venucci, who is very famous in Perugia, is much less well known here in the United States. And in fact, if he is remembered, it is usually as the teacher of Raphael. He had the dubious good fortune to have as his student one of the great geniuses of the history of art. But Perugino is such an accomplished artist that until a couple of years ago, this very portrait that we are looking at right now was hanging on the walls of the Uffizi with a label stating that it was a portrait of Perugino by Raphael. And it was recently proven, I'll show you why later, to be a Perugino. So his work is so fine that it can be mistaken for centuries for that of his famous pupil. Now, part of the reason Perugino's reputation fell from the heights that it achieved at the end of the 15th century, when he was considered the best master in Italy, has to do with the father of art history, Giorgio Vasari, whose dishy Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects introduces the history of art via biography, starting in the late 13th century, creating a sense of progression from those early masters like Cimabue and Giotto until his god, Michelangelo. And he really privileges Florentine art, and Vasari did not care for Perugino, and makes that very clear in his life of Perugino, except that he does mention that the frescoes in the Collegio del Cambio were very fine. So he does at least say that much. Now, this is a room that is in Perugia's town hall, which is this important civic building that you see on the left in this slide. So the building on the right in this slide is not, we don't see the facade, we just see the side of it, but it is the cathedral, the Duomo of Perugia. That fountain in the middle is another great work of Renaissance art. And then on the left, we have the Palazzo dei Priori, the Prior's Palace. This is Town Hall. This is Palazzo Vecchio in Florence. This is the analogous building in Perugia. We see it again here. We see a little bit more of it, and it would be extended over the centuries. But those 10 priors who ruled Perugia in the communal era, they were guild members. So Perugia was ruled not by the aristocracy, but by the guilds. And of those 10, 2 of them belonged to the Merchants Guild, which in 1390 got Perugia out of some sticky financial situations and therefore were awarded rooms in the palazzo itself. And so, of course, they had to decorate those rooms in very luxurious style, which at the time meant covering the walls with woodwork. They hired a northern artist from beyond the Alps to come create this sort of Gothic, dark, decorative design. Just a few hints of color, particularly these 4 figures over the pulpit: justice, fortitude, prudence, and temperance. Well, about a century later, the Money Changers Guild was also given rooms in this town hall. And they had 1 seat on the council of 10 priors. So the merchants have 2, the money changers have 1, the other 7 seats rotated between the remaining 42 guilds of Perugia. So that gives you a sense of how powerful the money changers and the merchants were. And so when they got their digs, they too wanted to decorate them in the most up-to-date style. But styles had changed in the intervening century. They start with the woodwork as well, and they hire an artist named Domenico del Tasso to do carved and intarsia, or inlaid woodworking. This griffin is the symbol of Perugia. If you join the Seattle Perugia Sister City Association for only $25 a year, you will receive the newsletter called Il Grifone, the Griffin, which I write. The Money Changers Guild symbol is the griffin, the symbol of Perugia, on top of a strong box. This is part of that design. Del Tasso also designed this, this tribune, this bank where the judges would sit, because part of the reason they were given this room is that the Pope, in the 1480s, granted the Money Changers Guild the authority to oversee court cases for any financial matter in Perugia. So prior to that, they were responsible for lawsuits that involved their members and specifically money changing. But any financial lawsuit, any financial case after the 1480s was seen to in this room. So it's not just a boardroom. This is also a courtroom. And the theme of justice is paramount. So they hired a Florentine artist to create that figure of justice that we see. So the woodwork is by Domenico del Tasso. You see the rampant griffin on either side. But in the center is a Florentine sculpture by Benedetto di Maiano, a gilded terracotta justice, which Benedetto sent to Perugia in 1492, although it may be from a decade or so earlier. So there it sits. But they also wanted paintings in this room, and there were two obvious choices for a painter. Two very highly regarded artists who were working in Perugia in these years. One of them was Pinturicchio, who was very closely associated with Perugino, in fact, who may have been Perugino's assistant in his Sistine Chapel frescoes. So this was an altarpiece he was painting for a Perugian church in the late 1690s. The other artist working in Perugia was Perugino, who was such a prominent artist in the 1690s that he had a workshop both in Florence and in Perugia. So he had very disciplined and highly trained assistants who had assimilated his style and could pump out Perugino's even if he was in the other city. Now, this altarpiece, the Ascension of Christ, was made for the Church of San Pietro in Perugia, and it was stolen by Napoleon. So the main parts, the Ascension of Christ and the lunette with God the Father, are now in Lyon. These two prophets on either side are in Nantes, which happens to be Seattle's French sister city. And only two of the little portraits at the bottom remain in Perugia itself. But the priors, or the officers of the Money Changers Guild, the Collegio del Cambio, decided that they wanted Perugino. And this is partly due to Perugino's fame, acquired and really cemented when he was one of the Central Italian artists called to Rome to decorate the walls of the Sistine Chapel about 25 to 30 years before Michelangelo would do the ceiling. So Perugino was chosen. And we know that the program for this cycle of frescoes was designed by a humanist, a man named Francesco Maturanzio. So we will see lots of, for instance, Latin inscriptions in the works that we're going to be looking at. Perugino had no Latin. Even his Italian is wonky. But these beautiful humanist inscriptions come from this new class of Renaissance scholar who has immersed they have immersed themselves in the literature of the classical past. They are, they're raiding monastery libraries trying to find any manuscript from Greek or Roman times that has been preserved. And Maturancio, perhaps the most prominent Perugian humanist, was particularly unusual because he had studied in Greece when Greece was under the control of the Ottoman Turks. It was very rare, but he thought that his Greek needed polishing. His Latin was perfect, and so he spent a year in Rhodes studying Greek. This is a terrible portrait of him. It's much later, but it was the only one I could find. So we have a preliminary contract for this, this room. And it mentions that the ceiling shall be decorated with the planets and their animals. And the ceiling is what you paint first when you paint fresco, which you are painting into wet plaster directly onto the walls. You start at the top because you don't want to paint something beautiful and then drip on it from above. And this ceiling is what we call an all antica, or in the antique style ceiling. That was the rage at the turn of the 16th century. Excavations were being done in Rome, sometimes accidentally, just digging a foundation for a new building, and they would find a Roman palace with painted, frescoed decoration in this style that became known as grotesque because the the Renaissance Romans thought that these underground rooms were grottos. They were, that we're talking Nero's Golden House, the Domus Aurea. They weren't grottos. The street level of Rome had risen in the intervening 1,500 years. So they had become underground. But this kind of decoration was not characteristic of Perugino's work. In fact, it was a specialty of his rival, Pinturicchio. So we suspect that Perugino promised that he would work in Pinturicchio's style in order to gain this commission. And he did so very convincingly, but the ceiling is not at all characteristic of Perugino's work. In the center, we find Apollo, the god of music and art and culture, holding forth with his 4 horses and his chariot, and in the chariot wheel is a Leo sign, the zodiac sign of Leo. Saturn has 2 wheels because there are 7 planets known at the time or believed to be planets, and 12 zodiac signs. So they have to distribute 12 symbols among 7 planets. Saturn's chariot is pulled by 2 dragons. And again, you can see this marvelous, grotesque work, these strange creatures, fantasy figures, women with wings, and people that seem to be growing out of foliage and so forth. Luna's chariot, with the sign of Cancer for the wheel, is pulled by 2 women. And we know the precise visual source for this ceiling. These images come from the woodcuts for an astronomical text by a German scholar, Johannes Angelus, called Astrolabium. And we know that Maturancio owned a copy of the original German text of 1488. And you can see, it's a little hard to see, that's not a great image on the left, but you can see that in the book, the woodcut shows Luna holding an arrow and the 2 women pulling the chariot. We can see Saturn. These are crude woodcuts. They are not high art. Perugino has even disrobed Saturn to bring him more in line with the Renaissance ideal of the classical nude figure. They've really transformed the source material. Venus's chariot is pulled by doves, and for this we have a very rare preparatory drawing. There are very few Perugino drawings surviving, but there are a few related to the Collegio del Cambio. And so this is the drawing for Venus. And the color scheme is more like the inset at upper left, but the Uffizi puts these ugly watermarks on their images. So imagine the thing at the right looking like the colors on the left. But so it's a red chalk drawing with very delicate silver. It's absolutely stunning, gorgeous drawing. Mercury is another of the gods who is represented, his chariot being pulled by birds of prey, and Jupiter's chariot is pulled by eagles. And then we have Mars, the god of war. Now, why Materanzio had lived much of his career in exile. And he had just in 1498, in fact, returned to Perugia, this great scholar. Why did Materanzio live so long outside of Perugia? Mars. Perugia was an incredibly violent city in the 15th century. So it was nominally ruled by these guild members, but they could not control the aristocracy, the rival factions of nobles, particularly the degli Odi and the Baglioni families. They were the Montagues and the Capulets of Perugia. Blood feuds, murder in the streets. So in disgust at the influence of Mars, of this martial, warlike attitude on Perugia, Materanzio had left the city for many years, and only in his maturity was persuaded to return. So we see these adaptations of those crude woodcuts. We see the grotesque, very fashionable, decorative designs, and we believe that in these years, one of Perugino's assistants would have been the young Raphael. There is no documentation whatsoever for Raphael being in Perugino's workshop, but there's a lot. So that we don't have the signed apprenticeship contract, but there's lots of word of mouth placing Perugino as Raphael's teacher, his master. We don't know the exact years, but it's believed that Raphael is here and that he's working on this ceiling. And this style, this grotesque style, is very similar to what Raphael will have his workshop execute in the Vatican Loggie about 15 years on. So that's the ceiling. Now we're going to look at the walls. And the first figure, the figure over the entrance, is Cato. And Cato was a figure who was very important to Materanzio because Cato was someone who chose exile over the chaos of of Rome in the period leading up to Julius Caesar seizing control. And somewhere in here I have the quote, but I'm not finding it. So under his feet, there is this beautiful Latin inscription that tells the viewer to put aside all love and hate when you are judging, when you are acting as an arbiter among your fellow men. And so this is a reminder to those officials of the Money Changers Guild who are overseeing lawsuits to be absolutely impartial and unbiased. And Cato is this very beautiful figure. Now, Cato is not the usual choice for a courtroom. The judgment of Solomon is much more common, or even north of the border, we might find something like Herod David's Judgment of Cambyses, which is absolutely contemporary with Perugino working in the Collegio del Cambio, which is also a civic commission for a courtroom in Bruges. And David's patrons choose the story of a king whose judge was found, or a judge who was found to be accepting bribes. And that's actually happening in the back on the left. There's a money changing hand, and that corrupt judge is then flayed alive, which you see happening on the right. It's absolutely grotesque. It's horrible. And that was up on the wall of a courtroom in Bruges. So Cato is a much more serene reminder not to be corrupt. So the rest of the room includes a mix of sacred and secular subjects, which is also quite characteristic of this moment in the Italian Renaissance that really valued the ancients. But there were only two subjects that were specified in that initial preliminary contract, and those two subjects were that Perugino should paint the Transfiguration and the Nativity. And these two scenes are on the rear wall. And they're sort of in reverse order. We tend to read from left to right, but on the right, Jesus is a baby. And on the left, Jesus is a full-grown man towards the end of his ministry. Jesus is, in fact, in this scene, Jesus is appearing in glory between Moses and Elijah. And the prophets Peter and James and John look on in astonishment. This is the moment where Jesus reveals himself as divine. And God the Father, in the Christian tradition, recognizes that. So within Christianity, believers are asked to believe that Jesus is both fully human, born of a woman in a stable, but in the usual messy way, but also fully divine. And the Transfiguration is the latter, that fully divine aspect. The Nativity is the former, that vulnerable baby, fully human, side by side on this wall. This composition is one that Perugino invented for a very important commission that no longer exists, the altarpiece of the Sistine Chapel. What altarpiece, you might ask? Well, the frescoed altarpiece of the Assumption of the Virgin that was destroyed when Michelangelo painted the Last Judgment on the altar wall. There were, in fact, 3 Peruginos on that prominent altar wall in the papal chapel. But in this composition, you have the Virgin at the top in this mandorla in a heavenly realm. And at the bottom, you have the apostles, still saintly, but in an earthbound realm. And Perugino uses that, a variation of that composition for the Transfiguration. And at the same time he's painting the Transfiguration, he uses a variation of the same composition for his, again, more complex Ascension of Christ. That altarpiece that I mentioned was stolen by Napoleon that was being painted for San Pietro. Now, if you visit Perugia, you know that San Pietro is about as far as you can be from the town hall while still being within the historic bounds of Perugia. But you want to make some variations. But look at the pose of Jesus. He's nakeder in the Ascension, but Perugino is using the same preparatory drawing, what we call a cartoon, a full-scale drawing that he transfers to the wood in this case, to the plaster in the case of the fresco. This is his figure of James, but you can see that Perugino, by this time, his style is becoming somewhat mannered. And repetitive, this way that he has of lifting the faces to the divine. And he makes that little sort of heavy eyelash there in the middle to add to this effect. It began to be a signature move, almost a tic of Perugino to paint, astonishment by divinity in this way. 17 or so years later, he would repeat the composition again in a painting for another Perugian church. This is much closer to the Collegio del Cambio work. He changes the color of the robes of everyone but Jesus. He changes the poses he gives. He gives John James's pose and so forth. But you can see that he is repeating his own formulas, which made him a very effective workshop administrator. He could just give his assistants the drawings and say, okay, switch these up and do this, but change the colors. And he could produce works very efficiently, but without the inspiration that the Renaissance artist was supposed to have. So that is the left-hand work on the back wall. On the right hand, we find the Nativity, which was one of the other scenes on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. There was a Nativity and a birth or a finding of Moses. And those are the destroyed frescoes. So we don't know what that nativity looked like, but this one takes place not so much in a manger as in a classical arcade with angels and a humble baby Jesus right on the ground in that fully human incarnation. These are paired with this fresco on the right of God the Father with prophets and sibyls. So, where am I? So if we look in that corner, we find these three Christian-ish subjects, in which we find Jesus into the two on the back wall, and then this third one, which we'll look at in a moment, is God the Father, that part of the Christian Trinity, but with pre-Christian figures, Hebrew prophets, Greek and Roman seers. And those three themes also embody the qualities, the Christian virtues of faith, hope, and charity. So faith is the transfiguration, charity, caritas, also known as love, in the nativity, and hope in this figure of the prophets and the sibyls that are said to have predicted the coming of a Savior born of a virgin, and so forth. Now, if the thought of putting prophets and sibyls together sounds a little familiar, that's because Michelangelo does it on the Sistine ceiling. So the figures on these thrones, punctuating the complicated visual architecture of the Sistine Chapel, are alternating Hebrew Bible prophets, Jonah, Jeremiah, and so forth, and Greek and Roman sibyls, these women who were said to have the gift of prophecy. Did Michelangelo visit Perugia? Did Michelangelo see this fresco of God the Father with the prophets and the sibyls? And did that make him decide, because it was actually Michelangelo, not some theologian or scholar, who designed the Sistine ceiling? We're not certain. We do not know if Michelangelo came to Perugia, but we know that he visited nearby Orvieto, also in northern Umbria, and that he deeply admired Luca Signorelli's frescoes in the San Brizio Chapel of Orvieto Cathedral that inspire Michelangelo's later Last Judgment. We do know, however, that Michelangelo's opinion of Perugino was not high. So if he did take inspiration from Perugino, he wouldn't have admitted it readily. And he may not have had to go that far, because in the Vatican apartments, there is a room painted by Pinturicchio, that other Umbrian artist, in which there are paired prophets and sibyls, in a more conservative style. And interestingly, between Michelangelo's list, Pinturicchio's list, and Perugino's list, they all chose a slightly different cast of characters. Perugino chooses 6 prophets and 6 sibyls, and these are Daniel, David, Jeremiah, and Solomon. It's interesting that he chooses to depict David as elderly and Solomon as young. Jeremiah is the tortured prophet of the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament, and does look rather gaunt in this description by Perugino. The sibyls are the Erythraean, the Persian, the Cumaean, the Libyan, And they're gorgeous. They are just lovely. And very typical Perugine-esque figures. Vasari said that once Perugino married in the early 1490s, he just painted his wife over and over and over, that every virgin and every sibyl is based on Perugino's young bride, but we do not know if there's any truth to that statement. We have, again, a preparatory study for this figure, the Cumaean sibyl, and around them they have these banderoles with some of the things that they prophesied, and this is a pen sketch, again the proper color in the inset, but it's a vigorous sketch. It's not nearly as delicate as that Venus. It's gorgeous. It's wonderful. I wish I could draw like this. Absolutely. Stunning and essential, and we have so few drawings by Perugino that it's fantastic to look at them. So we have this image of hope, of these non-Christian, pre-Christian individuals who nevertheless somehow, according to Christian thought, foresaw the coming of a Messiah. Now, you may remember that I showed you that altarpiece that Perugino was painting at the same time, the one that is in Lyon, and that it had a lunette on the top with God the Father. And in fact, the dimensions of God the Father in the lunette, that roundel at the top, are identical to the dimensions of the one in the fresco. So again, Perugino is being thrifty, recycling his design, using the same one for two different commissions, in different places in the same city. But you can see that even within the single commission, he's to paint the angels on either side, just used the same drawing and flipped it. It's a mirror image. And so this one has the wonderful rainbow around God the Father. The altarpiece has clouds, and he's added some cherubs. But around the time he's finishing up these commissions, he paints another important altarpiece. This one for Vallombrosa, an important monastery. And he uses the same God the Father in the roundel yet again. And just while we're here, notice the angel on the right, the archangel Michael in armor at the lower right. So we're going to turn to the left-hand wall of the Collegio del Cambio, where we find completely secular subjects that are drawn from classical thought. And each of these two lunettes that we see on the left-hand side features two virtues, female personifications at the top, and 6 antique heroes, which appear in two groups of 3, which comprise 2 Romans flanking a Greek. So on the left, Fabius Maximus, Roman. Socrates, Greek. Numa Pompilius, Roman, and so forth. At the top, prudence and justice. And there exists, still in a library in Perugia, the copy of Cicero's orations that was owned by Francesco Maturanzio, our humanist scholar who is coming up with the program for these works. So he finds things in Cicero, and there are notes in the margins of that book where he's picking out phrases to include in this painted cycle. For instance, Cicero says that the basis of virtue is prudence, justice, temperance, and what's the fourth one? Fortitude. Temperance and fortitude. And those are the 4 virtues that are painted here. But there are also those virtues that we saw in the Merchants Guild as well. So prudence has a little, chalkboard almost, a little framed inscription that talks about the virtue of prudence. And so does justice. Prudence holds a mirror. And prudence says that, she prevents men from regret. And down below her are philosophers and thinkers associated with the virtue of prudence. Justice, her little thing says that she rules the heavens as well as the underworld. She judges among mortals, and therefore she must be worshipped. She embraces truth and justice. So below her are ancient figures, including the Emperor Trajan, who wrote or had written a very important law compendium associated with justice. And it's possible that this scheme is inspired by the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, a room where Domenico Ghirlandaio frescoed triplets of notables from the ancient world. And interestingly, this commission was originally given not to Ghirlandaio, but to Perugino. But he put it off, and he put it off, and he put it off, and so eventually they just handed it to a different artist. But here we see Decius Mus, Scipio, and Cicero, who are going to appear in Perugino's frescoes as well. And again, this idea of tripling virtues. Prudence and justice look a lot like the Sibyls. They have, again, that characteristic Perugino physiognomy, this sort of perfect Tuscan beauty as they hold up their attributes. And then we find Socrates, for instance, as this somewhat grizzled but still beautiful elderly man. And he, too, is a Perugino type. We'll find him as an apostle, a Peter. We'll find him in other Perugino works as well. Fortitude and temperance have below them 6 antique heroes. So Fortitude's placard states that she is not afraid of death, and will do anything to protect her homeland or her loved ones. And the three heroes below her, Lucius Sicinius, Leonidas of Sparta, and Horatius Cocles, were all sent on suicide missions to defend their homeland. So they are all associated with this virtue of fortitude, of refusing to fear death. And then temperance is similarly, oh wait, here we get those antique heroes. And look in particular at Lucius Sicinius on the left. He actually survived his suicide mission. Leonidas, of course, was overrun by Persians. Horatius Cocles was killed trying to defend an important Roman bridge from an Etruscan invasion. But Lucius made it back alive. And in that pose, we see again the archangel pose that I pointed out to you a moment ago from the Val Ambrosa altarpiece, but we find it as well in Perugino's exactly contemporary Certosa of Pavia polyptych, where it is the Archangel Michael at the left, who is depicted winged, but with the same suit of armor, the same pose, the same shield, and maybe a slightly different tilt to the head. And this is actually based from another drawing that survives, a drawing that is evidently a life drawing. Perugino seems to have borrowed a suit of armor. These were not to be found at the local Woolworth. These were very expensive items. He borrowed a suit of armor and put maybe one of his workshop assistants in it, or hired someone to wear it while he sketched in detail the armor, the bucklers, the gauntlets, etc. The pose is based on Donatello's Saint George from Florence, from the Orsan Michele building, but Perugino adapts it in this life drawing and then uses this drawing as the basis of his ancient heroes and his archangels, anyone he needs to paint in a full suit of Renaissance armor. Leonidas is in more fanciful armor that is based on Roman sculpture. The kind of examples of sarcophagi and sculptures that Perugino would have seen when he was working in the Sistine Chapel. And just look how much fun Perugino is having with the helmets. The helmets are nuts. No one has ever gone into battle in helmets of this type. Again, fortitude and temperance, who is watering her wine, are Perugino types. They are those faces that could well be Mrs. Perugino, Mrs. Vannucci, but we think are probably just his ideal of feminine beauty. But the men, even these warriors, have a similar sort of beauty, have a kind of androgyny, these beautiful youths that are these examples of mighty warriors. Now, Scipio Africanus, although he is the great warrior who battled Carthage, he is not on the fortitude side. He is on the temperance side because of an episode in which he was awarded as war booty a young woman who was engaged to one of the enemy commanders. Now, when a Roman general received war booty, he could do whatever he wanted with it. He could rape that woman. He could enslave her. He could sell her. He chose to give her back untouched. untouched. And so there's, you'll find in Western art sometimes the scene called the Continence of Scipio, in which he is re-awarding this woman to her beloved and having them be married. So he's represented here not as a great general, but someone who restrained his lower impulses in favor of the virtue of temperance. And Pericles as well was believed to be someone who exercised that virtue in ancient Athens. So we have this wall of great heroes. And right between Trajan and Lucius Sicinius, Perugino painted a trompe-l'oeil portrait of himself. So he puts himself among these greats of the classical past. And in fact, below the self-portrait, which is the reason we now know that the Uffizi portrait is also a self-portrait, because they studied it for a recent exhibition on the occasion of the 500th anniversary of Perugino's death, and they found that the dimensions are identical between the fresco and the portrait in the Uffizi. In other words, he used the same cartoon. He places himself between these ancients, and Maturanzio wrote this flawless Latin inscription, which reads, Peter Perugino, distinguished painter. When the art of color had been lost, he rediscovered it with patient determination. And when no one was giving it life, he was the first to create art that was beautiful. End quote. It's quite a claim, and it is tied up with the Renaissance ideal of the artist who has rediscovered the art of color. And when Renaissance scholars talking about rediscovering the art, rediscovering art, revivifying art, they are talking about the art of classical antiquity that they considered had been lost during the Middle Ages. In fact, the whole idea of Middle Ages coming between classical antiquity and Renaissance, which means rebirth of classical antiquity, is a concept of Renaissance humanists who saw themselves coming out of dark ages and returning to a kind of art that was much more naturalistic, that was much more based in anatomy and perspective and the glories of the classical world. And this meant a leap in the status of the artist, who is no longer simply a craftsman, but a liberal artist, someone who works from their intellect. But such a concept is not really consonant with an artist who is recycling his workshop drawings for different works of art. And Perugino was not quite able to make that leap, that imaginative leap from the workshop culture of 15th century Tuscany and Umbria to fully embracing the classical past, as Raphael does a decade later in his School of Athens. This emblem of the high Renaissance fusion between the Christian present and the classical past, in which Raphael depicts the great philosophers of yore Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, Diogenes on the wall of the Pope's library. But at the right-hand edge, the very, very right, next to that column, Raphael paints a self-portrait, the figure with the black hat at the very right-hand edge, that young man, and next to him, the figure with the white hat, at the very edge, is a portrait of his teacher, Perugino. Because Raphael knew that even if Perugino couldn't fully make that transition into the high Renaissance of Raphael and Michelangelo, Raphael himself could only do it because he had cut his teeth painting goddesses and sibyls and prophets in the Collegio del Cambio. Thank you. Questions or images you'd like a second look at? Yes?
Did they ever depict charity or anything like that?
Did they ever depict charity? Yes, charity sometimes appears as an allegorical figure, usually a breastfeeding mother. Often with twins, sometimes triplets. Yes, and then there is the so-called theme of Roman charity, which I find one of the most repellent themes in the history of art. Are you ready for this? Roman charity is I cannot remember the names of, but you can look it up on, I'm sure Wikipedia would tell you. I can't remember the names of the Roman figures involved, but it's a woman visiting her father, her elderly father, who is starving in jail. He's been wrongfully imprisoned and is being neglected and left to die by cruel jailers. She is a nursing mother, and she gives her father nourishment. But it's icky. You'll find it sometimes in Baroque art, but for Raphael or Perugino, it was too much. Other questions? How many people in this room have been in the Collegio del Cambio? Yeah, that's a few. That probably tells us how many people here are actual SPSCA members as well. It's a phenomenal work of art. It is the most important work of Renaissance art in Perugia, which is saying quite a bit. And it's beautifully preserved. So I highly recommend it. Well, thank you so much for coming out, for supporting the cultural efforts of the Seattle Perugia Sister City Association. Thank you.